in the corner. It's the way to go. So my paper is Mercy, Mercy, Dear Americans, the display and discourse of mercy in the American Revolution. And my recent research has been on this virtue, this emotion, this disposition, this practice of mercy in the British world. And a little bit of product placement here. This was the first work, The Royal Throne of Mercy in British Culture in the Victorian Age, published in 2020, followed by this work in 2021. In the second work, I was keen to set out the intellectual and religious underpinnings to British understandings of mercy over these 2 centuries. British thought about, representation or inculcation of mercy were explored through surveying a variety of cultural productions, understood in terms of theatre, poetry, essays, novels, representation in 2- and 3-dimensional art. I also studied how this was embodied through ideas about gender and race, human-animal relations, pedagogy, and bodily performance such as gesture on the stage. The second section of the book approached mercy as practice and discourse along geographical and chronological axes. Beginning close to the British World Centre in use, the abuse of mercy across the Irish Sea under British rule, and then crossing the Channel to look at mercy's role in the global conflict of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic era. A British world scope was then extended by studying mercy rhetoric of empire, poetic, pamphlet, historiographic, contemporary newsprint. And then a case study focused on attempts to associate slavery abolition with the pre-Victorian monarchy. The book suggested by a very rapid tour concluding survey in the final chapter how 20th century British culture looked from the angle of mercy, taking in such themes as the discursive use of mercy in suffragette newspapers, the interwar detective novel, propagandist use of mercy in response to fascist and Soviet totalitarianism, and responses to the welfare state in the 1940s. But I'll begin, as we always tell our students not to begin essays with definitions, but in this case, 2 very old definitions from the early decades of the 18th century and from the end of the 18th century, or towards the end of the 18th century, quoting or referring to the definition of mercy provided by Samuel Johnson in his dictionary. So we can see that these authorities are struggling with what mercy is and doing what we shouldn't do, which is defining it by giving a whole string of other words, which might have their own historiography. And indeed, there have been plenty of studies of things such as pity and moderation and other such qualities. So what I'm going to do this afternoon is extract from my chapter 7 from the second book concerning the mercy of war. So that's what the chapter was purporting to do, was looking at warfare in relation to mercy from the time of the American War of Independence to the First World War. And thinking today about mercy's use in mercy's use by American revolutionary patriots, American loyalists, and British sympathisers or critics of the war in public address, newspaper propaganda, poetry, drama, history, and visual art. There will be some pictures, thankfully, in this talk. And I'm conscious that I'm probably addressing in this audience and on teams people who are far more expert than me in 18th century warfare, 18th century culture, and American history. So my title for this paper comes from an episode in the Continental Army's conduct of the war at Stoney-point by the Hudson River in July 1779, when victorious patriot troops heeded cries from the British, mercy, mercy, dear Americans, as they stormed the British fort. But I could also juxtapose the letter from General Thomas Gage, the British governor and commander-in-chief of Massachusetts, to the Continental Army's commander-in-chief, one George Washington, on the 13th of August 1775, and reprinted in American and British newspapers in that year, claiming that and there is General Thomas Gage, and this is what he's claiming. To the glory of civilized nations, humanity and war have been compatible, and compassion to the subdued is become almost a general system. Britons, ever preeminent in mercy, have outgone common examples and overlooked the criminal in the captive. So 3 cheers for British clemency and mercy. But another George Washington, publicly characterized British behaviour as consummated by the tender mercies of the Indian tomahawk, responding to General John Burgoyne's proclamation in 1777, and that's Washington's silhouette there. There's a great book which I was really inspired by when I was starting my study of mercy in British culture, and that was Nicola Eustace's Passion is the Gale, Emotion, Power and the Coming of the American Revolution, published in 2008. And amongst the many things that she did, she was showing tension in the late 1760s, this tension between American spirit contrasted with a British assumption that the colonials would submit to British royal mercy. I've necessarily had to, in the course of 2 books, argue that mercy isn't simply part of the vocabulary of humanity or just another word for pity or tenderness. We will find mercy cohabiting with these words and other concepts as I inundate you with lots of quotations and images. But I want to first of all say that mercy is an important word in pre-revolutionary religious culture, in this transatlantic religious culture. And a more extensive paper by somebody more versed in the theology of the pre-colonial time would discuss the divine order and mercy of loyalist religious discourse and the civil theology of government, public order and submission to mercy in the British Atlantic world. I think it's enough, though, for me here to assert the significance of a Christian idea of mercy for both patriot and loyalist Americans and the British. God's mercies belong to a providential order, whether colonial or in Britain, and human mercy ought to be displayed in dealing with rebellion and in the conduct of war. So here we have one image taken from an enamelled snuff box from the 18th century, showing George III with the divine eye of Providence looking over him. And if I can read it correctly, Britons rejoice and thank the Lord, in mercy will look over him. And it's a bit ambiguous whether it's George III looking over them, or God looking over them. But you can see that the design on the snuff box is really the reverse of the silhouette that we see of George III there. And I discovered this to my dismay after the 2nd book and the 1st book were published on Wikimedia. And it showed exactly what I wanted to encapsulate in my 1st book, particularly when I was doing a tour of the age before Queen Victoria. So here we have the young prince, the young George III, with the scales of justice, but in his hand pardon. And we can see here the description. It comes from I think the Newgate calendar. I've probably got the description up there, actually. So it's the Malefactors Register is the subtitle of it, from 1776, and we can see His Majesty George III personating justice and mercy. And we can see another image of the young king there, and we have, and I'm not going to attempt to shine the laser beam on the image here, but you can just make out the scales of justice with the allegorical figure on the left as well. So a typical allegory of monarchy with justice and truth here as well. I'm going to show another mixing of crown and mercy in my next image. And here we've got colonial paper currency from Pennsylvania, 1773. Obviously, we've got the crowns there, and we've got the state arms, and you can see the sort of motto underneath, mercy and justice. Okay. With rebellion's outbreak, a separate discourse of British and American behaviour developed. Patriot rebels unsurprisingly mobilised a rhetoric of British cruelty. They seized a moral high ground as humane, benevolent and merciful to shape British and European opinion. It was critical for their self-image to present the revolutionary cause and the agency of their armed forces as humane and Christian, defined against the British, who were barbarous, brutal and avaricious. Yet loyalists, not surprisingly, denied that a republic could be merciful, couldn't be as merciful as a monarchy, was their argument. Less successfully, though, the loyalists, in their propagandist effort than the Congress, emphasised their opponents' violence and cruelty. Mercy's I suppose, an act of the moment by merciful people, but it's also a calculated display in the Continental Army's conduct, as at that episode at Stoney-point in July 1779. And we can see it from commemoration of the event in a rendering of a medal struck after, and a 19th century engraving showing the taking of the fort. Congress demonstrated pursuit of a modern war of restraint and proportionality, even after, as here in 1779, a provocation in British massacres. The propaganda of mercy was an aspect of wider efforts by these patriots to characterise the war as a British decline from civilised values. And they concertedly gathered information on atrocities to report to Congress. Yet a violent war, emphasised by Holger Hook's Scars of Independence, published in 2017, came partly out of a violent pre-rebellion American society. And we can see mercy being extended or withheld in the battle, in treatment of enemy soldiers and sailors as prisoners of war, and towards civilians in what was, after all, a civil war. Mercilessness was also directed at Native Americans by the Continental Army and against African Americans. And I'm not looking at those two important categories of being cruel and merciless in this paper. Mercy helped separate out then and create two peoples. In the words of Benjamin Waterhouse, a surgeon on a privateer, whose memoir of British incarceration in the War of 1812 was dedicated to, quote, the common sense and humane feeling of America. And he said, the Americans are a kind, humane, tender-hearted people, as free from cruelty as any nation upon earth, and possessing as much generosity towards an enemy they have vanquished, and who is at their mercy, as any people to be found on the records of the humankind. For Waterhouse, their foes' tender mercies are cruelty. And he claimed a childhood diet of tales about English bravery, English generosity, the generosity of the British sailor, consuming literature, song and history, which had evoked what he saw in his adult life as a myth. But in fact, almost 4 decades of rhetoric had forged an image of unmerciful Britons since independence. The public relations war the 13 colonies won magnified Congress and patriot benevolence against British unmercifulness. As Linda Colley describes it, a propaganda walkover was achieved. So how have I constructed this study of the discourse of mercy in this conflict? I've used digitized newspapers, the Redex collection of American 18th century newspapers available via the British Library, and the British Library collection of British newspapers from the same period. I've drawn on digitized memoirs, including a range of captivity narratives, as well as 18th century and early 19th century history, poetry and play. The British state sought to overawe rebels with threats of dire punishment or win them over by promising mercy, but merciful overtures were satirised in the patriot press, as we'll see, as parodies of the virtue of mercy. These expressions, one would suppose, were designed as a sarcastic burlesque on a long series of cruelty and cowardly barbarity, as one wrote. The revolutionary and loyalist newspapers are especially important given word significance in this conflict. By the 1770s, there were just over 40 colonial newspapers growing out of a pre-revolutionary transatlantic system where Americans reprinted British news and the British press carried news of affairs in the American colonies. Patriot newspapers republished evidence of British atrocity gathered into reports for Congress, printed anecdote and commentary on British cruelty in the British Isles. So they were picking up on the newspapers in the British Isles as well, and circulated evidence of their humanity in Continental Army correspondence or reprinting the regulations on the conduct of war. So I looked at how mercy figured in patriot papers such as Isaiah Thomas's Massachusetts Spy, as well as loyalist titles like James Rivington of New York's Royal Gazette. A famous instance of patriot mercy withheld, attracting English poet, American dramatists, and countless artists, was the apprehension and execution in 1780 of the British spy John Andre. And my apologies for the variant accent at the end of his name. We'll see it migrate from left to right. But here we have John Andre from a 19th century American engraving, and then a rather grisly scene from the 18th century. So his execution by gallows and noose. His fate brought into question George Washington's mercifulness, and we've already seen me juxtaposing the two Georges, one as a critique of the barbarity of the British, and the British Gage saying how merciful they are. As ambiguous as that episode was the murder by Native Americans in British employ of the fiancée of a British soldier. Like Andre, the tragedy of Jane McCree in July 1770 was generative of also of much artistic, dramatic and propagandist commentary on the withholding of pity or mercy. So I'm just going to show you these images from the memorial of Andre in Westminster Abbey, partly to apologise for my misdating of it in the book where I say it happened in the 1820s. No, it had happened decades before. It just they chiselled more details as the body was reinterred in British soil. So here is part of the memorial, and we'll see another image of it later. I just want to show you the detail, which is supposed to be mercy, gesturing, weeping because of the sacrifice of Andre. But my next slides are on Jane McCrea being about to be slaughtered by Native Americans with their tomahawks raised. Cruel Britons who no pity feel. And you can see two British engravings representing the tragical death. And well, actually, that's from the New York Public Library digital collection. I think it may be an American version, but we have a British version, I think, as well. And you can see that there was verse about the death of Miss Jane McCrea, variant spellings of her surname as well, being blamed on Burgoyne's army and those in his pay. So I've not delved into archives at a local level. I'm not an American historian. There was a lockdown. I didn't cross Atlantic to go through the local archives to see what discussion of mercy as a policy and exchanges between local authorities and Congress there was. I didn't look at the language of mercy in petitioning, which you might expect there to be much about calling for mercy and pardon. And indeed in private writings such as journals and letters, unless they've been published subsequently. And one can add to the mix of things I didn't look at also, to any great extent, sermons. But sermons are an important expression, obviously, of religious ideas going into the war and as part of the discourse and communication in the war. And I think it's fair to say that it's easier to find representations of justice. And we can think about warfare nowadays and how people unleashing war on other parties talk about the justness of their cause, the sense of a crusade perhaps as well. And this is an image actually commenting on the Dutch coming into the war against the British. So Britannia is wielding a sort of justice here. There's no talk about mercy here. So in terms of visual representation during the conflict, either in Britain or in the colonies, I tended to find justice with her scales and sword figuring. I'm going to summarise what I have found to be the mercy discourse of the revolutionary era, the various types of mercy being represented, and they're coming from things like the Massachusetts spy. So in summary, the mercy discourse of the revolutionary era has the following features. The mercy of the British state imagined as forgiving father or mother. The victimised American at the mercy of the cruel British. The patriots appealed to divine mercy in the course of the war. The loyalist and British loyalist appealed to a God of mercy and order. So hopefully that'll be quotation one, and that's from the National Justice Vindicated. So that's not a newspaper, but it's, I think, possibly a sermon. Yeah. So using the British coronation oath also to govern in justice and mercy in patriot discourse. And my first book really looked at monarchy, the coronation, the oath that the monarch swore in terms of reigning in justice and mercy, and how this was used by patriots. Appealing to British mercy as an aspect of the British Constitution and monarchy then, and characterising British laws as based on mercy. So here the Massachusetts spy from 1775, the fundamental laws of England, which are laws of mercy. And then the parodic use of British mercy by patriots. So they're parodying these claims of British mercy and offers of mercy. Patriotic representation of British generals as unmerciful and Continental Army leaders by reverse as merciful. And a link made by patriots between American liberty and clemency and mercy. And a patriotic press discussion of withholding mercy from American traitors. And the loyalist presentation of patriots, not surprisingly, as unmerciful. So we can find loyalist poems making that point that there won't be mercy, was all their mercy ever did afford was pangs of bondage. Mercy is fundamentally about power, unsurprisingly figuring in British pro-American commentary as an aspect of colonial powerlessness in a system where colonies lacked direct political representation. So those in Britain defending the colonies to begin with, they're reliant, as they see it, colonists, reliant on an uncertain gift of imperial state mercy at the whim of the monarch and Parliament. To quote from a text from 1776, a prospect of the consequences of the present conduct of Great Britain towards America, acts of tenderness, lenity, and mercy were vouchsafed from a power despotic over us, and consequently under no obligation to confer such benefits. But the war showed the power of mercies displayed by American patriots, what one British commentator called unprincipled clemency. James Murray is almost complaining that the Americans, or that the Americans are seen as being unprincipled by being so merciful to the British soldiery. So here are some more quotes that one can find using search terms involving mercy and variance to see how in a variety of newspapers things like the constitutional the claims of constitutional mercy are being picked out and either extolled or parodied. So I want to turn in a moment to circulating tales of British unmercy. I'll show you, I think, a few more quotations. And it's important to note that what's happening in this transatlantic print culture is the picking up of press in Britain that's either favourable to the patriotic cause or against it. So when the Duke of Richmond, who's against the war, is presenting a petition on behalf of American prisoners in Plymouth, he's talking about the pragmatic approach that the British state should adopt. The certain consequence if we treat our prisoners of America with inhumanity when our own people are captured in America. So he's saying this in the House of Lords, and it's being repeated in the British press and reported then in America. And there is the Duke of Richmond. Okay. So press report, parody and anecdote offered the American patriot commentary on British mercilessness or battlefield clemency. In oral communication, patriot songs also referred to a struggle against merciless tyrants. And we have similar linking in song of the struggle with mercy and mercilessness on the part of American loyalists as well. They talk about plundering miscreants who craved no mercy and would have none. So in terms of circulating tales of British unmercy, the obvious thing, first of all, is to attack the cruelty of the British military leadership. So one privately circulated patriot newspaper, the Pasquin, or Minute Intelligencer from Egg Harbor, New Jersey in 1778, had a mock advertisement. And this is what it says: a mock advertisement for the Commander-in-Chief, General William Howe's miscellaneous works. So imagines, I don't know, 3 or 4 volumes of works of the great General Howe, where one of the articles was a dissertation on the cardinal virtues, in which it is proved that justice and mercy ought to be excluded from holding any rank amongst them. And I'm going to mention John Trumbull on several occasions, but confusingly for all of us, there's 2 different John Trumbulls. This John Trumbull is a highly successful writer of verse, the verse Mafingal, published in 1782. So a big success story, which was also printed in Britain as well. So Mafingal ironises, amongst many things, mercy from General Gage and the British. And here is one of the many references to mercy. Mercy is without dispute talking about Gage, his first and darling attribute. And then another British military leader, Charles Cornwallis. He's not surprisingly also being presented as a cruel general ordering no prisoners at the Battle of Camden in South Carolina in August 1780, however supplicating for mercy they may be found. And so that's talking about the execution of rebel fighters, and it's being picked up in a range of newspapers, including the New Jersey Journal. So some of these are picked up and reproduced in many American newspapers. And here is Cornwallis. Now, Cornwallis figures, or could figure potentially, in several of my chapters in my second book. He certainly figures in the earlier chapter on mercy in Ireland, And so in his later career, after a career of being a military leader, representative of the British Crown in India and in America, we have him similarly confronted with questions of mercy and justice in response to Irish rebellion in the time of the French Revolution. As I tell my students, never underestimate the power of pottery and handkerchiefs and transfer print for conveying political messages. So here we have on one side of this printed creamware jug, actually from the National Maritime Museum, but I've seen a version of it in Brighton in the museum there. We have Cornwallis with the figure of mercy to one side, and here from a piece of propaganda, it's like a headed piece of notepaper with a strange line of England with a human face seemingly on the left-hand side in a position of vice-regal mercy towards people petitioning for mercy in the Irish rebellion. But the key figure, and the key figure that I've already explored through the power of snuffbox enamel propaganda, is the king. The throne of mercy, after all, is this metaphor, this concept, which gives the title to my first study. So this is the person I want to turn to now in terms of circulating tale of British unmercy, because in the hands of American propagandists, it goes right back to the throne in Britain. So not just Parliament, not just merciless prime ministers and government, but the king. So the figure of the king. Loyalists in Britain and America extolled his virtues. And we've seen in that early slide how he's presented as the impersonation or the embodiment of justice, mercy. And in the conflict's initial stages, they appealed through verse to royal mercy, verse which appears in pamphlet, which appears in British newspapers. But we probably know that there's a general onslaught on this royal attribute by figures such as the Anglo-American radical Tom Paine, and satiric textual analysis picks out, just as Tom Paine and other people do, the nonsense of this grandiloquence of mercy. So there's textual analysis going on in Boston Gazette about reports of the royal speech. So errata, notes and queries of my subjects in America, for subjects read objects, i.e. objects of indignation, revenge and tyranny, etc., not a mercy or humanity. So, you know, there's plenty of grand offerings, gestures of mercy from the Crown via royal proclamation and through representatives on the ground. The American Patriot Press also offer what they think of as rather telling anecdotes. The Pennsylvania Packet, for instance, claimed in 1780 that at George III's coronation in 1760, the symbolic sword of mercy was left in the Tower of London. And rather than delay the ceremony, the Lord Mayor's sword was substituted. So no symbol of mercy was present at the coronation. They see that as a telling point. The king's mercilessness was underscored by reporting the execution in London in June 1777 of the macaroni parson, as he was called, the Reverend William Dodd. The American patriot poet Philip Freneau imagined dialogue between the British Whig opposition leader Charles James Fox and the king in 1779. You ask for mercy, can you cry to God who had no mercy on poor Parson Dodd? So this is an instance of George III not showing mercy to somebody who had even, I think, given sermons before him, this figure of William Dodd. So I've referred to anecdotal parodic treatment of British unmercy. There's more serious, I suppose, high art treatment of the question of mercy in the revolutionary battlefield. And I'm now turning to that other John Trumbull now, the soldier turned artist, whose famous death of General Warren at the Battle of Bunkers Hill, June 1775, I think completed in 1786, showed the by then London-based American artist's invention of an episode. And that episode is actually the image that has been used to promote this talk. And we'll see why it's so eloquent when I do a little bit of technical wizardry on my part. So what's going on here is an attempt to stay the cold steel of British outrage with this prone American figure. So he has invented this figure actually of Major John Small staying a fellow Britain's vengeful bayonet, I should say. So this didn't happen, but he's chosen to dramatize mercy on the battlefield, mercy even from Britons in this incident. This wasn't the only painting where he was wanting to convey mercy. So he also depicted Washington's treatment of the wounded Colonel Johann Rall in Capture of the Hessians at Trenton. And this was a work begun, I think, a year later, to give a lesson, to show mercy, as he said. So it's not just art historians surmising this. He actually said that he was intending or had intended to give a lesson to show mercy and kindness to a fallen enemy. So you can see that little snippet there of the great leader being merciful there. Okay, so that was hopefully giving you a sense of the attempt to present mercy in paintings after the event, after the conflict had run its course. Mercy figured in dramatic works by playwrights and poets subsequently as well. And they notably concerned that figure that I've already shown you, his sad, sorry fate, the British officer and spy, Major John Andre. And he was executed by hanging in 1780. His ignominious or sacrificial fate was a theme for both British and American painters, historians, memorialists, memoirists, poets, and playwrights. Sorry, we've got an image here, by the way, which I want to show you of working out the painting, and you can see it in the Yale University Art Gallery images that they publish online. So here is Trumbull sketching out the episode of mercy. But here is a monody on Major John Andre. You can see the accents changed course and direction by Miss Seward. So an English poet commenting on this in poetry. And this was published in 1781. And extraordinarily, it elicited an effort at justification by George Washington. She had condemned him for a Nero thirst for guiltless blood, and deplored his rejection of Andre's plea to die an officer's death, being shot at. He describes it, well, she describes it in his words that she gives him as the cold mercy of the warrior's sword, to be shot like an officer rather than being hanged like a dog or a common criminal. At the beginning of her poem, Britannia is disconsolate at military defeats, and bids steel-clad valour to chase away enfeebling mercy. So we can see in her work of art already there's a bit of tension. Does she want mercy? Does she not want mercy? Britannia at this point seems not to want mercy, but Andre is wanting the mercy to be given to him as an officer. Post-war plays dealt with mercy as well. So the Anglo-American loyalist son William Dunlap in Andre, a Tragedy of 1798 favours clemency, at least in the first version of the play. By such an act, the stern and blood-stained brow of war would be disarmed of half its gorgon horrors, more humanized customs be induced, and all the race of civilized man be blessed in the example. The Irish-American Republican John Burke's Bunker Hill, or The Death of General Warren, a play published in 1797, had Joseph Warren scorning Gage's offer of pardon and suggesting mercy should have been instead shown to Boston. I referred, in terms of the variety of the print material I'd surveyed to look at mercy discourse, to works of contemporary history, contemporary to the period. I'm just going to outline those as I move towards the end of this talk. The radical Reverend James Murray of Newcastle's Impartial History of the War, published in 1780, has several interesting extended comments on the British policy of mercy. One was on the failure to understand where the patriot position on mercy came from. Another dealt with General Howe and his brother Admiral Howe's bungling the politics of British clemency in 1776. There it is. And there is a little image of James Murray there as well. It's quite a complicated one to get to grips with, I think. But here goes. The ideas of mercy supposed in political states seldom answer the ends proposed by the offering of it. And this appeared evidently in the method now proposed of offering mercy to the Americans. It was mercy which was to be merited by actions to be performed, contrary to reasonable conviction of error, and was no way calculated to gain the affections or reach the heart. Mercy never supposes merit, but always implies forgiveness, freely and graciously bestowed, from a sense of which all rebellious principles and errors of mind are overcome, and those that are forgiven obey and return to their duty merely out of love. Had Lord and General Howe's mercy proceeded upon this principle, the American war had been ended long ago. Now, you can imagine in a project to look at discourse by patriots of mercy in America, that when you find that one of the noted historians of the patriot side has a name, Mercy Otis Warren, that it rather muddies the research waters. So the appropriately named Mercy Warren, also a dramatist, also a historian of the conflict history, appearing in 1805, thought the tendency to trumpet forth the godlike attributes of justice, equity, mercy, and above all, that universal benevolence and tenderness to mankind was too familiar in the etiquette of modern monarchical courts waging undemocratic warfare. For another American patriot, William Bailey, writing a decade after another Anglo-American conflict, which rehearsed the old trope of British mercy at the edge of the tomahawk, monarchical governments of Europe knew, quote, nothing of forgiveness. Mercy is continually in the mouths of all of them, as are justice, magnanimity, and many other of the amiabilities, but they are only there, and woe betide the man that puts an iota of confidence in them. I'm going to conclude now, although I look and it's about a page of conclusion. So, mercy figures in discourse generated by the military side to the American Revolution, alongside reports of cruelty extensively circulated in the Patriot press. Commentators in Britain argued, and this is quite a conventional way of treating mercy in war, for a merciful act of severity to crush a nascent rebellion. So to prevent a long drawn out war, you need to be severe, and it's merciful ultimately, or regretted the failure to pursue a policy of mercy, depending on their politics. I've approached mercy discourse as somebody claiming to be a cultural historian rather than a military historian, or indeed an expert on the revolutionary era. A recent historiography on the American War has returned violence centre stage to the revolution. So it's not a revolution of ideas, profound ideas about freedom and liberty. It's about violence, and that has been brought centre stage by people like Holger Hook, who I've mentioned earlier. And this research has also addressed the exaggerated patriot rhetoric of British brutality. I say exaggerated, but indisputably, American soldiers and sailors captive in prison in North America, crossing over the Atlantic to be imprisoned in Portsmouth, Plymouth, and other places, they had horrendous experiences. They faced death and incarceration. There were atrocities as at Tappan, Baylor's massacre in September 1778, committed by British forces. The legal historian Mugambe Jouet, in an essay published in 2021, sadly after my book had been published, contrasted modern mass incarceration and execution in America. So really thinking about the penal system in America now, a country with capital punishment, mass incarceration, racialized justice, with a mercy towards treasonous fellow white Americans during the revolution, in the aftermath of independence, and the several post-independence rebellions. Mildness of punishment was both a humane principle, but also political realism, from the first president down to the juries, grand and trial, and local communities trying to piece together a new polity. So this talk has been concerned with the mercy discourse about the war. The writings of the founding fathers would document their preoccupation with British unmercy in this context. This is, I think, quite an interesting revisionist comment in 1927. So Rupert Hughes, in perhaps a pioneering work of revisionism, a volume, one of the volumes of his biography of George Washington, talks about myths, and you'll have to take it on trust that he's saying the following: British have too many documents. The British have too many documents to prove that American mercy was as far from universal as British mercy was. So hits the headlines of the Toledo Newsbee in 1927. So to wrap up, my talk has highlighted a concept, mercy, with strong religious associations, surprisingly omitted from the historiography on patriotic positioning of humanity against British barbarity. It's been concerned with the discursive use of mercy, largely in print media, although I've shown you visual sources paintings which were then engraved as well and gestured, if ineptly, to oral culture, to sermons, to songs. As a study of Jane McCree's story by Jeremy Engels and Greg Goodale in 2009 argues, words won the Revolutionary War as much as cannonballs and bayonets. I hope the paper showed how the word mercy was a key word for belligerents on both sides. The success of the patriot propaganda of merciful reputation helped address this peculiar Anglo-American problem of establishing distance from one's adversaries, which Joel Varman explored 20 years ago. These were British people. How do we make ourselves different from those people who had been fellow Britons? The paper attempted to do so by picking up a key Christian moral virtue, one supposedly linked to monarchical rule by coronation ritual, to return to the theme of my first book on mercy, and which Britons evidently prided themselves upon as an inherent aspect of the constitution, their national character, and their conduct of war. And the charge of having a deficit of mercy was therefore troubling to them. Thank you.
James has kindly accepted to answer queries. So we'll start first with the people here in the floor, and then we'll see if there's any questions online. So, any questions? Yes, Javier.
Hello.
Thank you for a very interesting paper. And I mean, I've got several questions. I'm going to start with one, then we'll think with others. I mean, you show them lots of examples, and actually you conclude also your paper with this idea of whether there's a difference between Americans and British in that sense, and the idea of trying to define the differences or similarities in the time of revolutionary time, but also, of course, afterwards. And what is quite striking, personal, I mean, I'm also an Americanist, so I have very little knowledge of it, but it's very British narrative. It's not English. It's not. It seems to be this idea of Britishness, or early stages, perhaps, or new ways of thinking of Britishness and sense of identity connected to mercifulness and Americanness. And what is your impression here? I mean, are they sometimes are they talking about more regional identities in England, or is it very often just put under the umbrella of being British?
So I think, as we find often, both in the 18th and 19th and probably early 20th century, for British read English, but there's also a discourse emerging of Scottish as well, which is being used to. So Scottish mercy is a coded word for using the tomahawk. So I don't know why they single out the Scottish in particular, but there is that animosity about Scottish settlers and Scottish loyalists, I think, that emerges in some discourse as well. But yes, I think, I mean, it's obviously about a wider Britain, a greater Britain, a Britain of the colonies as well. So it's not just England and New England. So I think the word Britain, I mean, it's Britannia as well, the figure of Britannia as well. So in terms of national identity, I would say that mercy, along with other attributes, dispositions, is being used to mark off American identity. And so they're rewriting the history. They might acknowledge that there had been merciful Britons who didn't win the struggle to end the conflict before it became a conflict. And they might see merciful Britons in the past, but they're saying now we're dealing with a decadent parent in a way. Sometimes it's the language of the parent, sometimes it's the language of the cruel mother, or the mother who in the early stages of the war really should just admit that the daughter or the son has grown up and it's time to amicably part. And so, you know, a language of justice and punishment towards a recalcitrant child can also play into this language of clemency and punishment as well. I'm not sure that that's answered the question, Zavi, but it was a lovely question.
Yes, please, go ahead.
To sort of push on with the issue of differentiation, you talk about the differentiating the Scots, who perhaps they saw as somewhat barbaric people wearing skirts or something. There's quite clearly some kind of differentiation between groups they're willing to be merciful to.
Yes.
Washington, because of his history as a colonel against the Native Americans, is merciful to the Iroquois. Neither he nor Jefferson is very merciful to their slaves who escaped.
Absolutely.
Joined the Brits. But when I last studied this about 40 years ago, there was a lot of talk about Hessian atrocities.
Yes.
The German auxiliaries.
Yes.
Who were in was there any differentiation in the mercy?
So the way
dialogue in relation to them as opposed to the genuine Brits, if you want to.
No, because I think they're lumped in as, you know, this mercenary army brought across at the behest of the cruel king, and it's a sign of the tyranny. So that painting where George Washington is showing mercy to this Hessian officer is very eloquent of responding to that. So, hey, we're even mercy to these people who are notorious for their cruelty towards soldiers, prisoners of war. So yes. They are picking out all of these. So they're picking out the Native American allies of the British. They're picking out the Hessians, and they're picking out the British as well.
Yes, please.
I wanted to ask, how do you feel about bringing what your research in relation to modernity or where we are at the moment, and how these discourses of mercy apply in today's sort of, let's say, American narrative of how they see themselves? How do you feel about it? I mean, I just feel that the Americans still today like to be seen as merciful.
Yes.
Are going to go and liberate, and they use all these
yes.
vocabulary they use is very similar to what we've seen there, even though they might be doing something completely
yes.
different. That narrative to them.
It is, and I suppose so there's a problem, isn't there, because internally it doesn't look like it's a very merciful state to its own citizens when we think about the penal system and the mass incarceration, the executions and all of that. And then the projection since I guess the First World War, which is something I sort of referred to at the end of the second book. So they see themselves in defeating Germany in the First World War, and then the Second World War is this great global force for humanity, and with the United Nations, they see themselves as very much a force for good. I suppose it's complicated because the language post-war, post-1945, it doesn't really have mercy. It talks about humanitarianism and universal human rights. And one of the things I've been interested in teasing out is the contrast between a society where, and we're sort of refining this, we no longer accept this, but broadly a sort of secularized society in Britain, compared with obviously an America, which is still very religious, whether Christian or other faiths, where you would suspect that a language with mercy at the pulpit is very familiar to them, as it was a common word for people, you know, in Edwardian and Victorian and interwar Britain. So it's something that I'm looking at from a British side, and what I would say broadly in the British context post-war, it gradually descends to the idea of the language of mercy probe or mercy dash or mercy ship. But you can see that reference to things like mercy ships. They're going to be used in the Cold War, you know, I suppose the Korean War, the Vietnamese conflict. So these mercy hospitals sent by America to all sorts of benighted spots of the world as a projection of you know, the good empire versus the evil empire. So mercy and compassion are there, but it's also articulated in that language of human rights and humanitarianism. So again, it's a long-winded way, perhaps, of not saying directly. Okay.
Yes.
Yep.
I'm quite fascinated that justice and mercy.
Well, I suppose it depends on the context, doesn't it? So if somebody wants you to not be pardoned, they'll talk about either strict mercy or strict justice, and justice supposed to be severe and not forgiving. But it obviously depends on the context. In terms of the criminal justice system, they're supposed to be obviously I was going to say co-equal, but it obviously depends on what position you come from in terms of discussing justice in the legal system, because some people would say in a perfect legal system, perfect system of justice, there's no place for mercy. Mercy is a correction to an erroneous system. And this is, after all, what people like Bentham were arguing, all of that sort of Enlightenment project of reforming codes of justice and getting rid of monarchical mercy. And this is what we obviously see here. It seems to be down to the whim of a monarch that there's mercy or not. And they're not disputing that George III could be a good person, could be humane, but it's not the way that the colonies are arguing that things should go. But I mean, justice and mercy, they flick through the book. Rather, I mean, an unkind way of looking at my book is it's just another way of looking at cruelty or uncruelty as well. But there is a distinct vocabulary of mercy which evokes a distinct set of religious ideas, gestures as well, bodily dispositions. There's a visual vocabulary of mercy and justice. But I think, both sides are using the language of justice. And I guess it's because mercy seems, in a way, and certainly people in the 1960s onwards in Britain are saying there's a whiff of something old-fashioned about the word mercy. It's like some sort of Victorian name, whereas justice sounds like it should be sort of carved in granite in some sort of, big statue. But mercy sounds like a weaker virtue that comes along and sheds tears and doesn't impose justice. Yeah.
Please, yes.
Yeah, related to what you were saying just then, how does the concept of mercy map onto evolving ideas about the law of war?
Yes. So as I said, this is part of a broader chapter where I take it from the 18th century, but I could have taken it, from the medieval period onwards. So there's a sense in which mercy feeds into this development of conventions in the battlefield, chivalry and how to behave towards people of the same class, and then it's broadened out. So language of mercy is being explored and used when people are developing things like the Red Cross or talking about the Red Cross. It's there along with truth and justice when talking about the Geneva Convention as well. So I've been interested in that, but it's something that, say, by the end of the First World War, I was going through all of the documentation of the League of Nations, the English language documentation, and there are certain references by David Cecil to mercy in some of his writings, but it's not elaborated there, whereas the actual language of mercy is there in the propaganda of the First World War, often by reference to Shakespeare, who I surprisingly haven't mentioned here. And the quality of mercy, I think I probably just bypassed it in sort of research, but the quality of mercy is that quote from one of Shakespeare's mercy plays, who's is it Merchant of Venice? Or so it figures in 18th century and 19th century discussion of all sorts of activities where people want you to be merciful, and it figures in war as well. But I think, interestingly, because we're in the 19th century, we're in the age of the Gothic revival, or this representation of chivalry, that it's very easy to talk about the Germans and talk about the Allies in terms of chivalry and mercy as well. So mercy has this idea maybe of a medieval battlefield showing mercy, and the sort of visual representation in this historicizing age, these paintings of knights being begged for mercy by women. So the gendering of mercy probably feeds into this idea of mercy in war.
Thank you, that's fascinating.
More questions from the floor? Yes, Javier again. Okay, yes.
How important do you think the audience of, especially with the paintings and engravings and the writings, how important was meant to be for them? I mean, why was it so merchantable, this idea of writing a woman and so on? What was the game there, you think?
Because mercy is an esteemed value. It's a touchstone of good rule, of good military leadership, and if you can assign mercy to your own side, everyone, they're going to know that word, I guess, from every church service. That mercy is that key word that they hear, not just every Sunday. It's there in the sermons. It's there as part of common language. You know, people are saying all the time, "Oh, mercy me." So I think that probably makes sense. Sorry, what was the other part of?
So for the audience,
Yeah.
I mean, how important do you think that those artists, writers, or
Yeah.
we're very keen for the
Yes.
public, for the audience really to engage with this?
Yes. I suppose in some ways Mercy has, perhaps some of the scripts of Mercy have their own, you know, the language of sentiment in this age of sentimentality and feeling. If you've got somebody pleading for mercy or for pity, as I didn't suppress the word pity in one of the McCree prints, then you've got this idea of somebody on their knees begging for mercy from a cruel, soon to murder them, Native American with a tomahawk. So I guess there's dramatic gestures. You can do all of the drama, which is very eloquent, you know, the pose of mercy. So, and it's with that sort of painting, I was looking at it the other night, and, you know, that sort of, I'm going to say that in the wrong way, chiaroscuro, the sort of shade and the dark. So it's almost like a camera picking in the smoke of the battlefield on this moment of mercy, and there may be other moments of mercy in otherwise the melee, the fog, the violence of war. So it's, you know, it's dramatizing human mercy as an echo, I suppose, of the divine mercy. I suppose that light shining down rather like the eye of providence. I mean, another key word which is associated with mercy is providence, and the providence of God showing mercy to people in everyday life. You know, taking a tumble down the stairs and not having your head cracked open is an act of mercy, and people are documenting it. Evangelicals in Britain and no doubt America, in their spiritual diaries, are jotting down God's mercy. So a way of thinking about the world as being marked out by all sorts of mercies, big and small, mundane, and divine, and national mercy or lack of mercy. So I guess the defeat of Britain in this context was God's reckoning, a providential.
But that's the thing. I mean, with of course losing, I mean, does it also connect with rightfulness or not? I mean, does it connect to eventually after
Yes.
to the idea that the connection to not justice per se, but is it rightful? The rightfulness of having done that conflict or leading it, because of losing it, does it
Yes.
impact on the Britishness?
Well, so I mean, clearly they don't suppress this rich discourse of mercy, justice, and truth on the British side, and I guess what they do is emphasise the unmercy in treating the loyalists. So this big, although they don't really support the loyalists when they come over, or you know, the loyalists complain that they're not looked after, having sacrificed themselves. But I guess from the British perspective, those who are supporting the conflict would no doubt say that this just shows the hypocrisy of the Washingtons and other people. This is why the Andre case is quite interesting for them, and somebody like Selwood saying, and which is why Washington is responsive to it. I mean, he's got other more important things to do than respond to a fairly obscure poet about this, but is concerned about the slur on his name, on his honour, on his character.
Chris again.
A very practical question. Looking at your books, I just wondered, how did you navigate what must have been an enormous amount of source material?
So I've heard this line before. Sometimes books that we produce are more than we know about the subject, in the sense they're a distillation, a cogitation about it, and then we move on to other topics. And the book is the capture of our understanding. The problem. So the two books were one book originally, and the central motif was this idea of the throne of mercy running through it. It was a vast book, and to painfully wrench out what was so the metaphor of the crown of mercy, rather like the crown of thorns, you know, religious echoes, but this crown of mercy. So it's referred to, this diadem, this gem-like virtue is being picked up by everyone. You know, American, British from the 18th century, 19th century onwards. So nevertheless, I did. And I suppose I was in a happy place in the sense that I originally came to this project as a Victorianist. So it was a way of thinking about Queen Victoria in a different way, or at least I hoped it was. And moving on from my own research on capital punishment in the 19th century. So to think about the Queen in whose name people were still being incarcerated and, well, tried, incarcerated, and ultimately pardoned or executed. But I also think it's up to the reviewers and the readers to tell me whether it was navigated well or not.
It sounds like you started with a kind of organising principle.
I did. I did. I had to sacrifice quite a lot. There was a whole dimension of science fiction and the idea of mercy beyond. If you believe in the plurality of worlds and inhabited planets, is there mercy? Yeah. Well, no. So the next book was wondering, can I do mercy from the 1940s to the 1960s, 1970s? Is there still a place for mercy in popular culture, in literature, in detective works, in the post-war novel? How does it figure in science fiction? The mercy of the atomic apocalypse, and mercy on television. Place for today, and whether there's mercy there, mercy in things like, I don't know, this will not age me if I say things like William Hartnell and Patrick Troughton and Doctor Who and the Daleks. Aliens, do they have the capacity for mercy, or is it intrinsically a human? And then obviously the animal rights movement and mixomatosis and mercy squads. So there's still plenty. It all depends on whether it's something I feel driven to do or not. But yeah.
Fantastic. Great. So is there any question at home? If you have a question, unmute your microphone and just let us know.
I feel the weather has been merciful.
Yes. Yes, the chat area suddenly is not working for some reason. It's doing like that. So I take it that no, that there are no questions at home. Okay, so I think we'll stop the recording and first of all say thank you again.
Well, thank you for the question,
James. I mean, it was really fantastic. Thank you very, very much. Excellent.